"You're mine tonight," Vincent Rossi whispered, his grip tightening on her waist as the chandelier above the underground casino vibrated. New York's most feared man exuded total control until Josephine casually tossed a blood-stained silver ring onto the poker table. In an instant, the music died, and the deadliest man alive lost all the color in his face. The air inside the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was thick with the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne, aged scotch, and unspoken danger. To the untrained eye, it was a high society charity gala, a gathering of Manhattan's elite, philanthropists, and politicians rubbing shoulders over flutes of Dom Perignon. But to those who truly understood the pulse of the city, this was a summit. At the center of it all stood Vincent Rossi. Vincent was not a man who commanded attention by raising his voice. He commanded it simply by existing. At 35, he was the undisputed head of the Rossi Syndicate, an empire built on steel, shipping ports, and blood. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo that perfectly contoured his athletic, imposing frame, he observed the room with eyes as cold and grey as a winter storm over the Atlantic. He knew the secrets of every man in the room. He knew that District Attorney Wallace, currently laughing near the ice sculpture, had a crippling gambling debt that Vincent personally held. He knew that Arthur Pendleton, the seemingly righteous state senator, had a mistress tucked away in a penthouse Vincent owned. Vincent was a king, and tonight he was bored. "The shipments from Palermo cleared customs, boss," muttered Christian, his heavily scarred underboss, stepping into Vincent's peripheral vision. Christian was a pit bull in a tailored suit, loyal to a fault and brutally efficient. "Keep an eye on the docks anyway," Vincent replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that didn't carry past Christian's ears. "The Moretti family has been making noise in Brooklyn. If they so much as look at one of our containers, burn their warehouses to the ground. Consider it done." Vincent took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze sweeping over the sea of silk and diamonds. And then he saw her. She was an anomaly. In a room full of women, dripping in ostentatious jewelry, and trying desperately to catch the eye of the city's power players, she stood near the towering mahogany bar, entirely at ease, practically ignoring the spectacle around her. She wore a backless, midnight blue velvet gown that clung to her curves like a second skin, the fabric shifting like liquid as she moved. Her dark hair was pinned up elegantly, allowing a few stray curls to frame a face that could only be described as arresting. High cheekbones, full lips painted a dangerous shade of crimson, and eyes that were impossible to read from a distance. She wore no jewelry, no necklace, no earrings, no rings. In a room where wealth was weaponized, her bare skin was a statement of supreme confidence. But what truly caught Vincent's attention wasn't her beauty. It was the way she looked at him. When her eyes finally met his across the crowded room, she didn't quickly look away like the others did. She didn't blush. She didn't cower. She held his stare, her gaze tracing him with a terrifyingly calm calculation, as if she were a predator assessing whether he was worth the kill. Then she offered him a slow, mocking smirk, turned, and walked toward the VIP lounge, an area heavily guarded and strictly off-limits to anyone not personally invited by the syndicate. Vincent felt a sudden, foreign jolt in his chest. Intrigue. "Who is she?" Vincent asked. Not taking his eyes off the velvet curtain she had just disappeared behind. Christian followed his gaze, a frown deepening his scars. "I don't know." Security at the door was tight. VIP list only. She must be someone's +1. Maybe a high-end escort brought in by one of the senators. No, Vincent murmured, setting his glass down on a passing waiter's tray. That woman belongs to no one. Without another word, Vincent moved through the crowd. Men parted for him, like the Red Sea, cutting off their sentences mid-word as he walked past. He reached the velvet curtains of the VIP lounge, waving off the 2 heavily armed guards who stood at attention. He stepped inside. The VIP lounge was a dimly lit, soundproofed haven of dark mahogany, leather wingback chairs, and thick cigar smoke. There, sitting at the center of a high-stakes poker table, shuffling a deck of cards with the fluid, practiced grace of a casino dealer, was the woman in the midnight blue dress. She was entirely alone. "You're in the wrong room, sweetheart," Vincent said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet space. He closed the heavy oak door behind him, locking it with a sharp click. The woman didn't look up from the cards. She seamlessly split the deck, letting the cards cascade together with a satisfying zip. "Am I? I was told this is where the real games are played. The ones outside are so tedious." Her voice was like warm honey poured over crushed glass, smooth, sweet, but with a sharp, dangerous edge. Vincent walked slowly toward the table, unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a chair opposite her and sat, leaning forward, his large, calloused hands resting on the green felt. "The people who play in this room bet with things you can't afford to lose." "You don't know what I can afford, Mr. Rossi," she purred, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. Up close, her eyes were a striking, impossible shade of violet blue. Vincent's jaw tightened. She knew his name, not surprising, given his reputation. But it was the way she said it. Not with fear, not with reverence. She said it like it was a punchline to a joke only she understood. "I know every face in my city," Vincent said, his tone dropping an octave, radiating a lethal dominance. "I know every player, every politician, every rat and every ghost. But I don't know you. What's your name?" She smiled, sliding a single card face down across the table toward him. "Josephine." "Just Josephine? For now." Vincent stared at the card, then back at her. The air in the room was suddenly heavy, practically humming with electricity. He was a man used to absolute control, a man who broke spirits for a living. Yet, here was this woman, walking into his fortress, sitting at his table, and playing a game he hadn't consented to. The sheer audacity was intoxicating. He stood up, walking slowly around the large oval table until he was standing directly behind her. He could smell her perfume now, something intoxicating, a blend of dark vanilla, jasmine, and something distinctly metallic. "Gun oil?" He leaned down, placing a hand on the back of her chair, bringing his lips inches from her ear. He could see the pulse beating steadily in her neck. She didn't flinch. She didn't move away. "You're a long way from home, Josephine," Vincent whispered, his voice dangerously soft. He reached out, his fingers lightly trailing down her bare shoulder, feeling the shiver that betrayed her icy facade. His hand moved to her waist, gripping it with a firm, possessive strength. "You walked into my world," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin, fully leaning into his absolute authority. "You play my game. So here are the new rules. You don't leave this room until I say so. You don't speak unless I ask a question." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dark, absolute vow. "You're mine tonight." For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the room was so quiet, Vincent could hear the ticking of his Rolex. He expected her to gasp. He expected her to submit, or perhaps to slap him. I was prepared for anything. Anything except what she did next. Josephine threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't a nervous giggle, nor a hysterical shriek. It was a dark, rich, genuine laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls, slicing through the heavy tension like a machete. Vincent stepped back, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. His grip on her waist loosened, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. No one laughed at Vincent Rossi. Men had been buried alive in the foundations of the city's skyscrapers for far less than a smirk. "You think this is a joke?" Vincent asked, his voice now devoid of any warmth, replaced by the chilling deadness that usually preceded an execution. Josephine stopped laughing, though the amusement still danced in her violet eyes. She stood up slowly, turning to face him. Despite him towering over her, she looked at him as if he were a misbehaving child. "I think, Vincent," she said, using his first name with a casual disrespect that made his blood boil, "that you are exactly as arrogant as the files said you were. You're mine tonight." She rolled her eyes. "Please. That line belongs in a cheap romance novel, not in a room where men's lives are bartered." Before Vincent could signal the men outside, the heavy oak doors burst open. Christian strode in, followed by 2 massive enforcers, Lorenzo and Dante, their hands instinctively resting on the concealed weapons beneath their jackets. They had heard the laugh. In their world, anomalous noise meant a threat. "Boss? Everything okay in here?" Christian asked, his dark eyes instantly locking onto Josephine. Vincent raised a hand, stopping his men, but keeping his eyes locked on the woman. "I was just about to show our guest the door. Permanently." Josephine sighed, reaching for a small, sleek black velvet clutch resting on the edge of the poker table. "Hands where I can see them," Lorenzo barked, unholstering his suppressed pistol in a flash, aiming it directly at Josephine's chest. She paused, her hand hovering over the bag. She looked at the gun, then back to Vincent, raising an elegant eyebrow. "Are you really going to let your dogs bark at me, Vincent? After all, it's impolite to aim a weapon at family." Vincent frowned, confusion momentarily breaking his iron composure. "Family? You have 10 seconds to explain yourself before I let Lorenzo decorate the walls with your brains." Josephine opened the clutch with a slow, deliberate movement. She reached inside and pulled out a small, heavy object. She held it in her closed fist for a moment, letting the suspense hang in the suffocating air of the room. Then she opened her hand and dropped the object onto the green felt of the poker table. Clack! It was a heavy, silver signet ring. It was ancient, heavily oxidized, and bore a crest. A soaring eagle, clutching a broken sword, set atop a black onyx stone. But what made the breath catch in Vincent's throat was the dark, dried stain of old blood that crusted the inside of the silver band. The room instantly froze. The silence that descended was absolute, thick, and suffocating. Lorenzo lowered his gun, his hands visibly shaking. Christian, the ruthless underboss who had personally ordered the executions of dozens of men, took a stumbling step backward, his face draining of all color until he looked like a corpse. "That," Christian choked out, his voice trembling in a way Vincent had never heard before. "That's impossible. That ring is at the bottom of the East River, along with the hand that wore it." Vincent stared at the ring, his heart hammering against his ribs like a war drum. He knew that. Every made man in the American Mafia knew that ring. It belonged to Don Carlo Falcone, the previous capo dei capi, the boss of all bosses. 10 years ago, Vincent and Christian had orchestrated the coup that wiped out the Falcone family. They had burned the estate, killed the Don, his wife, and supposedly his only child. Christian had sworn to Vincent that he had personally cut the ring from the Don's finger and disposed of it. Vincent slowly raised his eyes from the blood-stained silver ring to the woman standing calmly before him. "Josephine isn't my real name, Vincent," she said softly, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "My name is Isabella Falcone." Vincent's mind raced. Isabella Falcone, the heir to the throne. She was supposed to be dead. She had been 10 years old when the estate burned. "You're lying," Vincent snarled, though a sliver of ice was beginning to inch down his spine. Isabella Falcone burned in the fire. Did she? Isabella tilted her head. Or did your trusted underboss, Christian, take a bribe from a federal agent that night to pull a little girl out of a burning window? Vincent whipped his head to look at Christian. The underboss was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically between Vincent and Isabella. Boss, I swear to God, she's lying. I killed her. I watched her burn." "You're sweating, Christian," Isabella noted coldly. "And you should be. Because I didn't just come here tonight to reveal myself. I came to claim what is legally mine." She reached into her clutch again, pulling out a folded piece of yellowed, heavy parchment paper. She tossed it onto the table next to the ring. "I'm not yours tonight, Vincent," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a lethal, chilling whisper that made the hair on the back of Vincent's neck stand up. "Because under the old laws of the Commission, the laws your syndicate still swears an oath in blood to uphold, I have been your legally bound wife for the last 15 years. The room spun. Vincent stared at the document. It was a proxy marriage certificate, signed and sealed by the old bosses, dated a week before the massacre. A peace treaty between the Rossi and Falcone families that had been forgotten in the bloodshed. "A wife cannot be a mistress, Vincent," Isabella smiled, a terrifying, beautiful expression of pure vengeance. "And according to the syndicate's laws, a living Falcone holds 50% voting power over every shell company, every port, and every offshore account you own." She leaned over the table, picking up the blood-stained silver ring and slipping it onto her thumb. "I don't belong to you," she whispered, the violet in her eyes flashing with dangerous fire. "You are in my house, and as of 10 minutes ago, I transferred the title deeds of this hotel, your Brooklyn ports, and your Cayman accounts into a blind trust." Isabella turned to Christian, who was now hyperventilating. "Oh, and Vincent, if you kill me tonight, the dead man's switch on the trust defaults everything to the FBI. So tell your dog to put his gun away, darling. We have a lot of catching up to do." Vincent Rossi, the deadliest man in New York, stood completely paralyzed. For the first time in his life, the king had been placed in checkmate. The heavy mahogany walls of the St. Regis VIP lounge seemed to close in as the weight of Isabella's words settled over the room. Vincent Rossi did not blink. His steely grey eyes remained locked on the violet gaze of the woman who had just dismantled his entire empire with a single piece of yellowed parchment. He looked at the ring on her thumb, the Falcone crest, the dried blood of a Don he had ordered dead a decade ago. "You're a ghost," Vincent finally said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre that vibrated through the floorboards. "I prefer the term resurrection," Isabella countered smoothly, snapping her velvet clutch shut. Behind Vincent, the sound of ragged, panicked breathing broke the tension. Christian, the brutal, heavily scarred underboss of the Rossi syndicate, was practically hyperventilating. His eyes darted toward the exit, calculating his odds. "Boss, she's bluffing," Christian stammered, stepping forward, his hand inching toward the Sig Sauer P2226 holstered beneath his jacket. "That paper means nothing. She's a rogue element. Let Lorenzo and me take her down to the harbor. I'll make sure she stays dead this time." Isabella didn't even look at Christian. She kept her eyes on Vincent, a knowing, mocking smile playing on her crimson lips. "He's terrified, Vincent," she whispered, "and he should be. Because 10 years ago, he took $2 million from the federal task force to ensure I escaped the fire at the Falcone estate before your men struck. He sold your absolute victory for a retirement fund in the Caymans. Treachery is the only currency that always pays out in blood. Old Cosa Nostra proverb." Vincent slowly turned his head to look at his second-in-command. The temperature in the room plummeted. Christian froze, his hand hovering over his holster. "Is this true, Dom?" Vincent asked. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, a terrifying calm that usually preceded a massacre. "No, Vincent, I swear on my mother's grave," Christian yelled, pulling his weapon. But he didn't aim it at Isabella. In his blind panic, realizing his betrayal had been exposed, he aimed it directly at Vincent's chest. It was the last mistake Christian ever made. Vincent moved with the explosive speed of a predatory cat. In a blur of motion, he sidestepped the barrel of the Sig Sauer, his left hand gripping Christian's wrist and snapping it violently upward. With his right hand, Vincent drew the sleek Glock 19 from his own waistband and fired a single, suppressed shot. Thwip! Christian's eyes widened in shock as a dark red bloom appeared precisely between his eyes. He collapsed heavily onto the Persian rug, his blood rapidly seeping into the ornate wool fibers. Lorenzo, the other enforcer, immediately dropped to one knee, lowering his head in a gesture of absolute submission to his boss. Vincent calmly holstered his weapon and adjusted the cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo. He turned back to Isabella. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't even blinked. "A messy divorce," Vincent noted coldly, gesturing to the body on the floor. "A necessary house cleaning," Isabella corrected. She walked around the poker table, stepping delicately over Christian's outstretched arm in her high-heeled Louboutins. She stopped mere inches from Vincent, entirely unfazed by the fresh murder that had just taken place. Vincent looked down at her. The anger simmering beneath his ribs was violently clashing with an undeniable electric surge of respect. He had spent his life surrounded by men who cowered at his shadow. Now, he was face to face with a woman who had walked into his inner sanctum, weaponized his own laws against him, and orchestrated the execution of his traitorous underboss without ever dirtying her own hands. "So my wife," Vincent said, testing the word on his tongue like a foreign, dangerous liquor. "You hold 50% of my legitimate fronts, the shipping ports in Brooklyn, the offshore accounts through Chase Private Client, and the real estate trusts managed by Skadden Arps. You have a dead man's switch tied to the FBI. You've backed me into a corner." "I haven't backed you into a corner, Vincent. I've invited you to the table," Isabella said, reaching up to adjust the silk lapel of his tuxedo. The intimacy of the gesture was a stark contrast to the blood on the floor. The Moretti family is moving on your territory because they sense weakness. They know you don't have the political connections my father had. They know the old blood families still view you as a usurper. Vincent's jaw tightened. She was right. The Rossi syndicate had power and brute force, but they lacked the aristocratic legitimacy that the 5 families demanded. "If we step out of this room together," Isabella continued, her voice dropping to a hypnotic murmur, "as husband and wife, the Falcone and Rossi bloodlines unite. The old families will have no choice but to bow. The Morettis will be isolated. We don't just rule New York, Vincent. We own it." Vincent stared into her violet eyes. She was offering him the world, wrapped in a death threat. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Isabella smiled, a dangerous, breathtaking sight. "Then you spend the rest of your short life fighting a war on 2 fronts, the Morettis on the streets and me in the boardrooms. I promise you, darling, I am much more lethal with a pen than they are with their guns." Vincent stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then a low, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was genuine. "You're completely insane," Vincent said, though the hostility in his voice had vanished, replaced by a dark, possessive approval. "I'm a Falcone," she replied simply. "Lorenzo," Vincent barked without looking away from Isabella. "Yes, boss," Lorenzo answered quickly from the floor. "Get a cleanup crew for Christian, then prep the armored Maybach. My wife and I are leaving." Isabella's eyes flashed with triumph, but as Vincent stepped closer, closing the distance between them until their bodies brushed, she realized he wasn't submitting. He was matching her move. He leaned down, his lips grazing her ear. "You played a brilliant hand, Isabella. You have your 50%. You have your revenge on Christian. But if we walk out of those doors as a united front, it's not a game anymore. You are mine in the eyes of the Commission. You sit at my table, you sleep in my house, and if anyone tries to touch you, I will burn their world to ash. Are you prepared for that?" A shiver ran down Isabella's spine, betraying her icy exterior. She looked up at him, her heart beating wildly against her ribs. "I was born for this, Vincent. We'll see." Vincent offered her his arm. Isabella took it, her slender fingers wrapping around the solid muscle of his forearm. Together, they walked out of the VIP lounge, leaving the corpse of the traitor behind them. The descent through the St. Regis was a masterclass in psychological warfare. As they walked through the grand ballroom, the whispered chatter died instantly. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the terrifying spectacle. Vincent Rossi, the city's apex predator, walking arm in arm with a stunning, unknown woman who carried herself with the lethal grace of royalty. They reached the private underground parking garage. The air was cool and smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. Lorenzo was waiting by the black, heavily armored Mercedes Maybach S6A Dazer. But something was wrong. Vincent felt it a split second before the screech of tires echoed through the cavernous garage. "Get down!" Vincent roared. He tackled Isabella to the cold concrete, just as a barrage of automatic gunfire shattered the silence. The deafening roar of AK-47s ripped through the air, sparking violently off the Maybach's bulletproof chassis. 2 black SUVs had blocked the exit ramp. Men in tactical gear were pouring out. The Moretti family. They hadn't waited. Vincent dragged Isabella behind the heavy engine block of the Maybach, drawing his Glock. Lorenzo was already returning fire from the rear tire, taking down one of the attackers before a burst of gunfire forced him into cover. "Stay here!" Vincent yelled over the deafening noise, his eyes blazing with adrenaline. To his absolute shock, Isabella didn't cower. She reached beneath the slit of her velvet gown, her hand emerging with a compact silver Beretta 92 FS strapped to her thigh. She cocked it with a sharp, practiced snap. "I didn't spend the last 10 years hiding in a convent, Vincent," she yelled back, her eyes wild, fierce, and entirely fearless. Before Vincent could stop her, Isabella pivoted around the front bumper, firing 2 suppressed shots with terrifying precision. A Moretti gunman on the left flank dropped instantly, clutching a shattered kneecap. Vincent grinned, a exhilarating rush flooding his veins. He stepped out from cover, laying down heavy covering fire while Lorenzo flanked the remaining attackers. The Rossi boss moved like a machine, cold and efficient, dropping 2 more men with calculated headshots. The remaining Moretti thugs, realizing their ambush had catastrophically failed against the combined force of the syndicate boss and his lethal new partner, scrambled back into the remaining SUV and peeled out of the garage, leaving their dead behind. The garage fell dead silent, save for the hiss of a punctured radiator. Vincent lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. He turned to look at Isabella. She was leaning against the shattered side mirror of the Maybach, her midnight blue dress perfectly intact, her silver Beretta still smoking slightly in her grip. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her violet eyes blown wide with the fading rush of combat. She looked entirely unhinged. She looked magnificent. Vincent walked over to her, his heavy boots crunching on broken safety glass. He stopped in front of her, the smell of gunpowder and his expensive cologne wrapping around them in the dim light. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't check her for injuries. Instead, he reached out, gripping the back of her neck with a possessive, bruised hand, pulling her flush against his chest. "You missed a spot of blood on your cheek," Vincent whispered, his breath hot against her skin. Isabella looked up at him, her lips parted. The tension between them was no longer just a power struggle. It was a raging, undeniable inferno. "I suppose," Isabella breathed, staring at his lips, "you'll just have to clean it off for me." Vincent didn't hesitate. He crushed his mouth against hers, kissing her with all the violence, passion, and absolute dominance of a king claiming his queen. The Mafia boss who took everything had finally found the one woman who could take it all back, and in the shadows of the bullet-riddled garage, a new, terrifying dynasty was born. If you survived the crossfire of this mafia drama, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to swear your allegiance to the Rossi Falcone Syndicate. Share this video with your fellow romance and thriller addicts, and subscribe for more heart-stopping, action-packed storytelling. We upload new twists, dark romances, and deadly secrets every single week. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a hit. Welcome to the family.